What is up, guys? Randomonium here. This is your Week 2 Fantasy LCS analysis and breakdown video for the 2017 Summer Split. In this video, I'm going to talk about all of the matchups for Week 2 for both NA and EU LCS. I will also be talking about the results from Week 1. So if you haven't seen some of those matches and you don't want the results spoiled, this is your spoiler warning. But we're going to be doing a new system with these videos for this split. I'm going to be trying out something new. And I'm always trying to improve these videos and come up with better systems for you guys. So this split, I'm going to try and innovate, and I might fall flat on my face, but that's part of trying to improve. Sometimes you fail, but I feel like in the past, a lot of these videos I've just been telling you guys what to think rather than teaching you how to think. And that's something I really try to avoid. Like, I've done a lot of coaching and mentoring and tutoring in the past, and I never try to tell people what to think. I always try to teach them how to think and let them make their own decisions. Because I feel like that's a lot more powerful. The whole, giving a man a fish vice, teaching a man how to fish kind of thing. So that's what I'm going to try and do with these videos, and I'm sure that, at first it's not going to be flawless. There's going to be issues with it, so I definitely encourage some constructive feedback on how I can make these videos better in the future. But the goal of these videos is, one, I want to make it so that it takes less time for me to actually produce these videos, because I am working a lot more nowadays, and it's become harder and harder to get these videos out in a timely manner. And these videos are very time sensitive, right? The final matches end Sunday night, and then the LCS week starts back up on Thursday, around midday for me. So that makes it very difficult. That's a very short time period for me to, analyze all the statistics, put together this video, and then get it uploaded. And the goal ultimately is actually to try and get these videos uploaded, Monday night. So that way you guys have a little bit more time to actually, digest them. Or if you miss it, the first day, then you have another chance to catch it before the week locks, and you can't change out players. So that's the first step. I want to try and reduce the amount of time it takes for me to make these videos so that I can get them out sooner. I also want to reduce the amount of time that these videos are in length. I want to give you the same amount of information, or maybe even a little bit more, in a shorter period of time. So I'm trying to make these videos denser. I'm trying to make them more efficient. So that's another goal, but the consequence of that is that it's going to require you guys to pay a little bit more attention. It's going to require you guys to think a little bit more critically. I'm not going to just be spoon-feeding you information. I'm going to basically giving you a fire hose and expecting you guys to drink from it, or at least that's my goal, is to just give you just so much information, and then, let you guys make your decisions. So I want to try and help you guys think critically, to make the best decisions for you, because every single person is different, and different people want to take different amounts of risk with their fantasy LCS team. Some people like to play very safe, and they like to go for those safe picks, and some people like to live on the edge and go for those really risky picks. And if I'm just telling you guys who to start every week, I'm not really differing that message for those different kind of play styles. I'm just giving you my play style rather than adapting the video for your play style. So these videos hopefully can be more individualized, where I can say, hey, if you're a riskier player, you should go for this, and if you're a safer player, you should go for that. And I can kind of give you all the factors that will go into my decision making, so that hopefully you can kind of take that and make your own decision, and maybe even help me improve my own processes, because I haven't solved how to do fantasy LCS. I'm not 100% accurate all the time. I'm trying to get there, but I'm always looking for ways to improve, ways to do better, and ways to kind of convey this information to you in a better format. So this is my first attempt, and if you like it, like it. If you hate it, you hate it. Just give me some constructive feedback, and I'll try to make it better every single week. So let's get right into it right now. So this is how we're going to start every single week. Is we're going to break down every single week every single team, every single role, and we're going to kind of just analyze how each team and each player has performed. And we're going to do this for all of the weeks that have passed. So in the future, we're still going to cover week 1, and then we're going to cover also week 2, week 3, week 4, so we can see trends, right? So we can see if players are consistently performing better than their team, if the team is performing better than we would expect them to, if the team is getting better, if the team is getting worse, what are the different trends that are going on. So this will help us better predict who we should start in coming weeks, which teams are on the rise, which teams are on the fall. So that's the goal with these videos in the future. So you can see that I have a row for every single team, and then I've got columns for every single role. So I've also color coordinated the different players based on what their grade was for that week. So if they were S tier for week 1, then they're in purple. If they were A tier, then they're in red. If they were B tier, then they're in blue. C tier, they're in green. And D tier, they're in yellow. On the right side of the screen, I have who their opponents were and what the results were from those matches. So if they had a 2-0 win, then that's in purple. If they had a 2-1 win, then that's in red. If it's a 1-2 loss, then it's in green. And if it's an 0-2 loss, then it's in yellow. And then I've also got the overall record for that week, whether they went 2-0, 1-1, 0-2, or for the the EU players if they went 1-0 or 0-1. And we're basically what we're going to do is we're going to compare the players within a given team and see if that matches up with what we would expect them to score based on the result that they had from that week. And we're also going to see who's performing better than expected, who's performing worse than expected. For example, let's look at TSM. So TSM, they beat Cloud9. They went 2-0 against Cloud9, but they went 0-2 against Immortals. So their overall record was 1-1. So based on a 1-1 record, we'd expect them to be running kind of middle of the pack. So we're expecting them to be kind of B tier, maybe C tier. And that's exactly kind of what we see. So we see that we've got some B tier people, we've got some C tier people, and we're seeing that it looks like Bjergsen and Doublelift are performing a little bit better than the rest of the team. So there's only been 1 week, so we can't really say that there's a trend yet, but that's definitely something we want to look at in the future. Is we want to see, do Bjergsen and Doublelift continue to outperform their teammates. And then based off of this information, we can then look at the upcoming week and we can say, okay, TSM is probably going to be around, an A tier team this week. So if I expect them to be around an A tier team this week, then maybe, Bjergsen and Doublelift might be S tier. But, the rest of the team might be, A tier or B tier, so maybe I don't want to start, Hans or Svenskeren, but if I've got Bjergsen or Doublelift, then maybe I want to take that gamble and play those guys, even if they have a difficult week. So just keep this in mind, all the different players that are performing better than expected when we get into the next slides that are going to cover the upcoming week for week 2. All right, next up we've got Cloud9. I'm going to be breaking down every single one of these teams this week, just so you guys understand what the processes are. But in the future weeks, I'm going to go a lot faster. So I'm not going to break this down as slowly. So this video is going to be a little bit longer this week, but in future weeks, it's going to be kind of rapid fire. So Cloud9, they had a really bad week. They went 0-2, lost to CLG, lost to TSM. So we'd expect them to be like C tier, maybe even D tier, based on the fact that they went 0-2. But that's not what we see at all with Cloud9. We see that Contracts was A tier. We see that Jensen was A tier, and even Sneaky and Smoothie were B tier. So that showed to me that even when Cloud9 loses, they get more fantasy points than expected. So if they win, then they're probably going to be, even higher. So I definitely, even though the Cloud9 had a bad week in week 1, they are obviously very good fantasy players because they can still get fantasy points even when they lose, which means that when they win, they're going to probably be S tier, especially Contracts and Jensen. Phoenix 1 also had a really bad week. They went 0-2. They lost to Immortals. They lost to Envy. But both of those losses were 1-2s. So we'd expect them to be kind of C tier. Maybe even into B tier, based off, depending on how other teams performed. But if you take a game off of each one of your opponents, and that's pretty good. It kind of puts you more in the middle of the pack. But what we see actually is that Phoenix 1 actually performed better than expected, especially Arrow and Shady. They were both S tier. Anori was A tier. So those three players I'm definitely looking at in the future, that they can perform even when Phoenix 1 does poorly. They can still get a lot of fantasy points. So I'm going to keep an eye on them in future weeks. And even if like Phoenix 1 had like a difficult week this week, I would still probably start like Arrow and Shady because they proved that even in a bad week they can still put up a lot of fantasy points. FlyQuest is the next team. They got skunked in week 1. They didn't win a single game. They went 0-2 against Echo Fox, 0-2 against Dignitas. So we'd expect them to be probably D tier based off of these results. But they actually were C tier. So they performed a little bit better than expected. But we didn't really have anybody that stood out because they got smashed so easily. So it's kind of hard to say who we should start from FlyQuest, if anyone. And especially considering that Echo Fox and Dignitas were not considered to be, top tier teams, so we can only expect that if FlyQuest went up against an even better team, that they'd do even worse. So it's kind of hard to have an argument to start anybody on FlyQuest right now. They definitely are not performing as well as they should be, probably. So I'd probably be, if it was my team, I'd probably be benching a lot of the FlyQuest players this week. CLG performed phenomenal. They went 2-0. They beat Cloud9. They beat Team Liquid. We'd expect them to be A tier or S tier most likely. And we see that across the board they're mostly A tier, so that's fine. We see that Darshan was S tier, so he performed better than the rest of his team. Dardoch was B tier, so he performed slightly worse than the rest of his team. So that's something we want to keep in mind, right? CLG, if I've got Darshan, like Darshan looked like he was really hot in week 1, so maybe I want to start him in week 2 if CLG has a decent week. So definitely, Darshan's stock is on the rise. Dardoch's stock is a little bit lower. But CLG as a team is looking very strong, so they're most likely, pretty good starters. Dignitas is another team that looked very well. They beat Envy, they beat FlyQuest. So they didn't beat like top tier teams, but they won both of their matches. So we would expect them to be A tier or S tier based off of the 2-0 win that they got. But that's not what we see at all, right? We see that their bot lane was C tier, support was C tier, and that's never a good sign. And then, thankfully, their top lane, jungle, mid lane were, their team, their top lane, and their jungle were all A tier. So those are the people that I'd be looking at. So I'd be looking at Someday and Chaser. But mid lane, bot lane, even their support, I'd probably be shying away from because it looks like they're not putting up a lot of fantasy points based on their results. So if they can only put up, C tier or B tier points, and they got a 2-0 week, imagine how few points they would get if the team went 1-1 or 0-2. Okay, Immortals. Immortals was another team that went 2-0, so we would expect them to be S tier or A tier, and that's exactly what we see. We see that Flame was S tier, we see Xmithy was S tier, we see Pobelter was S tier, and the rest of the team was A tier. So this kind of is, trending as we would expect them to, so we're definitely keeping an eye on Flame, Xmithy, Pobelter, especially on Immortals, and Immortals looks like they're a very good team. They 2-0'd TSM. That's not an easy thing to do. So Immortals is definitely showing that they're one of the contenders, if not one of the best teams in NA right now. Echo Fox was another team that went 2-0, so we'd expect them to be A tier or maybe even S tier, but we don't see that with them, right? Froggen played very well. He was A tier. They got team points. They were S tier. Acadian got B tier, which, it's not horrible, but I would expect him to actually do better than that for, Echo Fox going 2-0. I think A lot of that had to do with how long the matches lasted, because if matches don't go on long enough, you don't have enough time to rack up a lot of fantasy points. And it looks like both of these were kind of stomps. So that might be causing their fantasy points to be a bit lower, but it's definitely some cause for concern when you go 2-0 and yet you're still C tier in top lane, bot lane, and support. That means that if you go 1-1 or 0-2, that you're looking at C tier or D tier for those players. So I would be very hesitant about some of these Echo Fox players. Froggen and Acadian definitely are still on my radar as kind of sleeper picks, but the rest of Echo Fox I'm definitely nervous about. Team Liquid, really rough week. They got skunked, and they performed as expected. They were D tier across the board. So yeah, definitely Team Liquid did not look very good this week. So I definitely would not be starting them. Because CLG is a very good team. Echo Fox looks like they're kind of middle of the pack. So Team Liquid is most likely going to struggle against most teams in the LCS if they can't even take a game off of CLG or Echo Fox. And then finally, Envy. So Envy actually had a surprising. They went 1-1. They lost to Dignitas 1-2, and then they beat Phoenix 1-2-1. So we'd expect them to be kind of B tier. Maybe C tier, and that's kind of what we see. We're looking kind of at the Seraph in the top lane, and we're looking at Hakuo in support. Seem like that they're doing better than the rest of the team. So Seraph is probably the guy that I'd be looking at most closely with Envy, but I'd probably only pick him up if Envy had a really favorable week, because I don't think that at best they're a middle of the pack team. They're probably bottom half, near the bottom. So that's basically how the breakdown's going to go for NA. And if we had other weeks, we would go into the other weeks and talk about how things change from week to week. But we're going to go into EU now. And EU was a very polarizing week. We had a lot of S tier teams and we had a lot of D tier teams. So G2 had 3 substitutes. They played Rockhat. They beat Rockhat 2 games to 1. But they had 3 substitutes. Top lane, jungle, mid were all subs. And Sven, of course, did pretty well. He got A tier, but you really can't. I can't say anything about G2 because over half the team was not playing in week 1. So I don't have really any opinion on G2. I know G2 is a great team, but I don't have any statistical data to back up how good they are at fantasy yet. I'll have a better idea next week for week 2. Unicorns of Love only played 1 match. They played Vitality. They won 2-0, and they were pretty much S tier across the board. So it's kind of hard to say, who's necessarily better or worse on the Unicorns of Love team. But it's clear that Unicorns of Love can put up a lot of fantasy points when they win. So definitely looking at Unicorns of Love when they have favorable weeks, they are very good starters. Same can be said for Fnatic. Fnatic went 2-0 against Misfits, 2-0 against Ninjas, and they were S tier across the board. They put up some of the highest fantasy points in the league in every single role. So Fnatic they looked phenomenal. So yeah, I'm definitely looking at Fnatic, especially when they have a favorable week. They rack up a lot of fantasy points. So yeah, definitely have my eye on Fnatic as a very good fantasy LCS team. Misfits had a very disappointing week. They went 0-2 against Fnatic. They didn't get any points. That the double points did not help them at all because they got shut out by Fnatic. So they were D tier across the board. I still think that Misfits is a good team. I just think that only having that one match that week really kind of screwed them. So it's kind of hard to draw any patterns based off of this 1 week performance from Misfits. H2K was another team that had a very good week 1. They went 2-0 against Splice. They went 2-0 against Monkeys. They were S tier across the board. So definitely looking at H2K as another one of these teams that does very well, puts up a lot of fantasy points. Splice obviously lost to H2K 0-2. They were D tier across the board, which is kind of unexpected. It kind of shows that when you only have one match in the EU LCS and you lose, you get really screwed in fantasy points. So keep that in mind. We're seeing this reoccurring theme where the team that loses, that only has one match, does not get a lot of fantasy points. So you see Misfits didn't get a lot of fantasy points. Splice didn't get a lot of fantasy points. And then Vitality, which is the next team we're talking about, they went up against Unicorns of Love and got 0-2'd by Unicorns of Love, didn't get a lot of fantasy points. So when you're looking at your teams, if you think it's going to be an 0-2 loss, you probably want to bench those players. If it's going to be a 1-2 loss, then maybe you can justify playing them. Or if they're going to, possibly win, if they have a chance of upsetting, then you can maybe play them, but it's a lot higher risk. That's what you have to take away from this, is that teams that only have one match a week are very high risk. It can be all or nothing with those kind of teams. Rockcat, we already talked about. They went up against G2. G2 had the 3 subs. Rockcat didn't look horrible, but I mean, you would expect that they should be able to beat G2, and G2 is missing half their team, but they still lost. So this kind of shows that Rockcat is probably near the bottom of the EU LCS. They did do pretty well in top lane and support. So Faxi and Wadid did pretty well, considering that they only had one match and they went 1-2. I would expect them to be kind of, C tier, maybe B tier. But they had a couple of A tier players, so I can't take that away from them. But I definitely don't think that Rockcat is a terribly strong team this split. Monkeys, got 0-2'd by H2K, and they were D tier across the board. You had another team that got skunked and was D tier in the EU, and then Ninjas in Pajamas, they got 0-2'd by Fnatic, but they actually did better than the rest of the teams. They were C tier across the board, except for mid lane. Nogni, he went B tier. So I definitely have my eye on Ninjas in Pajamas. I don't think they're a very good team yet, but they definitely put up more fantasy points than I would expect them to, based on the result that they had in week 1. So that's something to keep in mind, is if the team starts improving, in the mid portion of the split or the later portion of the split. Alright, so let's talk about week 2. So this is my new graph kind of showing you kind of risk versus reward for week 2. So you can see I've got reward in the vertical direction and I've got risk in the horizontal direction. So the goal is that you want to maximize your reward and minimize your risk. So the teams that are kind of the best for that are the teams that are in the upper left-hand corner. That's why they're got a purple square around them. So they're kind of the S-tier teams. Then I've got the teams that are still above that dotted line, because the dotted line represents kind of like, the even bet, kind of the 50-50 bet. So you want to be above and to the left of that dotted line if possible. So you can see that those are my A-tier teams. Those are CLG, TSM, and Splice. And then I've got my B-tier teams. These are my really high-risk, high-reward teams. Those are H2K, Fnatic, and Vitality. Then I've got my C-tier teams, which are slightly below the dotted line, so they're most likely going to give you less reward for the risk that they provide. But if you don't want to take a lot of risk, they might be a better option than, say, some of the B-tier teams. And those are Phoenix 1, Dignitas, and Envy. And then the teams in yellow are the teams that I'd avoid. So let's break down kind of what's going to happen in week 2 and why I put them into these different groups. So Immortals, I said Immortals has the lowest risk out of anyone, and they have a very high reward. And that's based on the fact that they're going up against Envy and FlyQuest this week. FlyQuest didn't look very good in week 1. Envy looked okay, but I think Immortals is a strong favorite to win both of those games. And since Immortals put up a lot of fantasy points in week 1, I think they can put up a lot of fantasy points again in week 2. Misfits also has a very easy week 2. So they had a really disappointing week 1. I do think they're going to bounce back. They're going up against Ninjas in Pajamas and Rockcat. I think they can easily beat both of those teams. I think they're much better than both of those teams. So they should be able to 2-0 this week. But you definitely have there's some questions that need to be answered, because they got really stomped by Fnatic in week 1. G2. Another team that I've got up in the S tier, but they have slightly more risk. And the reason for that is they're going up against Fnatic in one of their matches. I do think the G2 is favored to win that match, but Fnatic could upset them. That is a possibility, but I definitely give the edge to G2 in that matchup. And then to make things easier on them, they have also got a second match in Ninjas in Pajamas, which I think they should be able to win easily. So they're going to get fantasy points from Ninjas in Pajamas, and they could get a lot of fantasy points from Fnatic if they're able to beat Fnatic. So they're slightly higher risk, but they're very high reward. Unicorns of Love is in a similar boat. They've got one easy match this week in Monkeys, and they've got one hard match this week in H2K. I give Unicorns of Love a slight advantage against H2K, and because they've got that second easier match, that's going to allow them to get a lot of fantasy points this week, even if they lose a close one to H2K. And my final kind of S tier team is Cloud9. They had a really bad week 1. Week 2, they're going up against Phoenix 1 and Echo Fox. I think they can beat both of those teams, but both of those teams have the possibility of upsetting Cloud9 because Cloud9 did not look very good in week 1. I have no idea if they're going to be starting Ray or if they're going to be starting Impact. I haven't seen any official announcements if they're doing like odd weeks with Ray and even weeks with Impact or something like that. But yeah, I think Cloud9 will be able to get a 2-0 this week. But I definitely have them a bit higher risk and a bit lower reward compared to some of those other teams. So for the A tier, CLG is the first one on my A tier. So CLG is going up against Echo Fox, which I think they can win, and they're going up against TSM. Now this is like the match of the week, CLG versus TSM, and I actually give CLG the advantage. CLG looked really freaking good in week 1. This is a really heated rivalry, and TSM has won a lot of these matchups, but TSM did not look as strong in week 1 as CLG did, and then on top of that, TSM really didn't get any time off between MSI and the start of the summer split. So CLG is much more rested. They've had more time on this to practice on this patch. They've had more time to recover. They've had more time to see family and recharge after the spring split. TSM has not had that luxury, so we would expect that TSM would be struggling a little bit more at the beginning of the split, which is why I kind of give CLG the advantage in week 2. So CLG is I definitely think that there's a huge possibility that TSM will win against CLG, but I do give CLG the slight edge, which is why CLG is only A tier and isn't in the S tier. I've also got TSM up in the A tier because even though I think that they are at a slight disadvantage against CLG, I think it's going to be a really close match, which means that TSM will still get fantasy points from that match. I think it'll go to game 3, so that'll give TSM at least one game worth of good fantasy points in that series. And then they're also going up against Dignitas, and I think they should be able to beat Dignitas. So they've got one guaranteed win pretty much, and then they've got one maybe win. So that gives them, more reward than the risk that is associated with that team. And the final team I have is Splice, and this is a hard one because Splice is going up against Vitality. And Splice and Vitality both looked pretty shaky in week 1. So I think this is one of the closest matches this week, along with the CLG TSM match. And I actually give a slight edge to Vitality because Yamato is now on Vitality, and I feel like Yamato was the person who made Splice. He kind of got all the players he wanted and kind of gelled the team together. So he knows how to exploit these Splice players, because these Splice players nobody had heard of any of the Splice players before they formed into this team that Yamato Cannon built. So I think that Yamato's got something up his sleeve that's going to give Vitality an edge, but I think it's going to be close. I think it's going to go 3 games, and I do think that Splice has the possibility of winning it. The reason why Splice is A tier instead of like B tier or C tier is because they're also going against Monkeys. And I think the Splice can beat Monkeys. So they're going to have one game where they're going to be guaranteed some good fantasy points, and in the Vitality game they could get a lot of fantasy points, or they could get average fantasy points. So that kind of moves them into the into the A tier, but they're definitely not as high reward as some of the other teams on this list. So that moves us on to the B tier, and these are my high-risk teams. So you can see I've got H2K, Fnatic, and Vitality, and the reason why these teams are all high-risk is because they've all got one match this week. So H2K is going up against Unicorns of Love. I think that Unicorns of Love has a slight edge, but H2K could definitely upset them. If H2K upsets Unicorns of Love, they will get a ton of fantasy points. The same can be said for Fnatic. Fnatic is going against G2. If Fnatic is able to upset G2, then they will get a ton of fantasy points. However, that's a very big if, on both of those teams. So that's why they're very high risk and very high reward. So I would shy away from starting multiple people on these teams unless you really like taking a lot of risk with your team. I might be starting one, maybe two players from these teams just because they're so high risk right now. There's a chance they could be S tier, and there's a chance that they could be D tier this week. And then finally, of course, Vitality. Vitality I put with H2K and Fnatic, even though Vitality I don't think is as good as H2K or Fnatic. Because they're going up against Splice, I think that will be a very close match. I think that there is the potential that Vitality will get a lot of points. But if they lose the Splice, they will also be very low. They'll be C tier or D tier. So if you like Risk, go for those three teams. If you don't like Risk, shy away from them. Do not start players from those teams because those are all very high risk, high reward teams this week. C tier teams. These are the teams that are probably safer picks than the B tier teams, but they're going to be lower reward. That's the trade-off. So Phoenix 1, Dignitas, and Envy. So Phoenix 1, they've got Cloud9 and they've got FlyQuest. I don't think they're going to beat Cloud9, but I do give them a slight edge against FlyQuest. So you're looking at most likely going to be a 1-1. And I think that especially like Arrow could do really well. So I might start Arrow, even though it's a less than optimal week for Phoenix 1. Arrow still might be like A tier or even S tier. The same could be said for Shady. He could possibly go off pretty strong this split with Arrow. So even though Phoenix 1 doesn't have a great week, that doesn't mean that there aren't some players within the Phoenix 1 roster that you wouldn't want to start. And those three were Inori, Arrow, and Shady that I'm definitely looking at that do better than the rest of their team. For Dignitas, so Dignitas has TSM, which is a rough matchup for them. I think TSM is going to be very hungry to kind of avenge that 2-0 loss against Immortals. And then on top of that, Dignitas has Team Liquid, which I think that they can beat Team Liquid. But it's not the best week for Dignitas. I think they're going to go 1-1. So, when we saw that they went 2-0 in week 1, they didn't put up S tier points. So like Someday and Chaser, I might be looking at possibly, but I probably would be shying away from the rest of Dignitas this week. Envy was another one of those teams that kind of they were lukewarm in week 1, and then this week is a bit harder. They're going up into Immortals, which had a phenomenal week 1. And then they're going against Team Liquid. So I think that Envy can beat Team Liquid. I don't give them much of a shot against Immortals. So you're looking at a 1-1 week for them, which means that they're most likely going to get roughly the same amount of fantasy points that they got in week 1, since week 1 was also a 1-1. So you're looking at C tier, maybe B tier on somebody like Seraph or Hakuo. So Seraph and Hakuo are the two people that I could possibly start, but I probably wouldn't start anybody else on that team if I could avoid it. And then, of course, our D-tier teams, Echo Fox, for example, I think that they're actually a lot better this split than they were last split, but this week is just not a good week for them. They're going against CLG and Cloud9, so I think they're going to struggle this week. I'd avoid playing anyone from Echo Fox. If you have to, probably the only people I would consider would be Froggen or Acadian. But even they are going to have trouble. Even they are probably going to only be B tier maximum this week. FlyQuest, definitely looks like they're struggling a bit more at the beginning of this split. They're going against Immortals and Phoenix 1, so I definitely think that it's going to be a bit rough on them. I think they're probably going to lose both of those matches, and I probably wouldn't start any of them because they kind of, when they went 0-2 in week 1, they were C tier across the board, so you probably can get somebody better on your team. Rockat's got they've only got one match this week, and it's up against Misfits, which I think they're going to lose to, and we saw what happened to teams that lost and only had one match, so I would expect that Rockats is probably going to be D tier this week. Ninjas in Pajamas, they've got 2 matches this week, but they're going up against Misfits and G2, which is just awful for them, so I don't think that they're going to win a game in either of those matches, so they're most likely going to be D tier. Same for Monkeys, they're going up against Unicorns of Love and Splice. It's slightly better for them than for Ninjas, but they might be able to get a game off of Splice, but probably not, so it's most likely going to also be D tier for them. And then finally, Team Liquid has Envy and Dignitas, which isn't a horrible week for Team Liquid, but they just look so bad in week 1 that I can't encourage you guys to pick anyone up on Team Liquid this week. They do not look very good right now. I think the only person who... Actually, I would say that the Matt and Piglet are doing okay, but the rest of the team is doing really, really bad. And you can't win with just 2 players, unless you're G2, of course. But yeah, so those are the teams that I would avoid this week. So basically the takeaway from this is, if you can, play the S tier teams because they're the highest reward with the lowest risk mainly. If you want to avoid a lot of risk, you want to go for your A tier teams next, and then probably the C tier team. So A tier if you can, C tier if you can't. If you want to go for more riskier plays, and go for those B tier teams, the H2K, Fnatic, Vitality, and then avoid the D tier teams. Try to get somebody else to start on your team for week 2. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I know this is a new system. I know it's a little more complicated. I know I'm asking you guys to think a little bit more critically, and I'm not, holding your hand the whole process and just basically telling you what to do. My goal is to hopefully, make it more individualized so that I give you guys the tools to make your own decisions. And I will help you guys along the way. But if you leave comments like, hey, should I start this person or this person? It's very helpful if you include, hey, I like taking risk, or I don't like taking risk, or including who else you have on the team, because, do you really want to start 3 players from the same team, or do you want to, play the same players on the same team as your opponent, things like that. There are other factors you need to consider besides just this player or that player. So happy to help you guys. Love some feedback, but this is going to be the format that I'm going to be trying out and trying to improve it every week. But I hope you guys have a fantastic day. I hope you guys have a great week too. I hope your guys' fantasy leagues are doing well, unless you're in a fantasy league with me. In that case, I hope that you all lose and that I win because, I like winning. But we'll have some friendly competition, and I'll see you guys next week. I hope you all have a fantastic day. This is Ranmonium signing off.